at 59. Martha Hale was 30 days away from losing the 164-acre Iowa corn farm she and her late husband had spent 34 years building. Caleb had been gone for 18 months. 2 bad harvests had drained what little cushion remained. Medical bills and equipment repairs had piled up, and now the bank had delivered the notice she feared most: bring the delinquent loan current or face foreclosure. Her daughter begged her to sell while there was still something left to save. Her neighbors said pride couldn't make loan payments. Even the numbers on Martha's own kitchen table told her the farm was finished. But Martha made a decision that seemed almost foolish. She refused to leave. She sold equipment, cut expenses to the bone, and worked the fields alone. Determined that the bank would never take Hale Farm while she could still stand on it. Some people in Bell Creek quietly wondered why a 59-year-old widow was fighting to save land buried under debt when walking away seemed like the only sensible choice. Then, while searching through Caleb's old farm records for anything she might have missed, Martha discovered something strange. Hidden among ordinary seed invoices and harvest totals were names of local families, beside thousands of dollars they had once owed the Hales, but the amounts had been crossed out. One entry stopped her cold. Briggs, $4,800. Paid enough. Martha knew the Briggs family. She also knew they had never repaid that money. And when she began asking why Caleb had erased their debt, she uncovered something about Hale Farm that would eventually bring trucks, cars, farmers, mechanics, teachers, shopkeepers, and families from across Bell Creek down her county road just hours before the bank could take everything. But Martha didn't know that yet. All she knew was that her dead husband had forgiven thousands of dollars their own struggling farm could barely afford to lose, and she was about to discover why. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, or late at night where you are. I hope you're having a wonderful day. And if you enjoy emotional stories about ordinary people facing impossible choices, forgotten acts of kindness, and the surprising ways a community can change someone's life, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story. Now, back to Martha, the foreclosure notice waiting in Caleb's desk, and one mysterious line in an old farm ledger that was about to change everything she thought she knew. Before sunrise, Martha Hale stood at the edge of the north field with a flashlight in one hand and a notebook tucked beneath her arm, listening to dry corn leaves scrape against one another in the dark. At 59, she no longer needed an alarm. Farm work had trained her body to wake before the sky did. She pulled an ear from the nearest row, split the husk, and pressed a thumbnail into a kernel. Too much moisture still. Another delay she could not afford. The season had not been disastrous, but it had been bad enough. Rain came late when she needed it early. Then too much arrived before harvest. Diesel cost more than she had budgeted. A bearing in the combine had started whining again, and the repair estimate sat unopened beside the kitchen phone because Martha already knew she did not have room for it. Back at the machine shed, she wrote down the moisture reading and checked the fuel gauge on the tractor. She had been stretching each tank farther than she liked, combining errands, postponing field work that could wait, and telling herself efficiency was not the same thing as desperation. On the workbench lay an unpaid supplier invoice beneath a wrench. She turned it face down. Caleb would have hated that. Her husband had believed every bill belonged where you could see it. 18 months after his death, Martha still sometimes caught herself thinking she should ask him what to pay first. By 7, she had fed herself toast over the sink, checked the weather, and carried yesterday's mail to the kitchen table. Most of it was ordinary seed advertising, a county notice, an insurance statement. One envelope was certified, Hawthorne Community Bank. Martha stared at it longer than necessary. She had spoken to Ben Carter twice that month. She knew what the letter probably said. Still, she opened everything else first. 20 minutes later, she drove into Bell Creek with the envelope unopened on the passenger seat. Ben met her in his office behind the bank lobby. He was 45, careful with his words, and had known Martha and Caleb for years. That made the conversation worse. "I was hoping you'd call before this went out," he said. Martha placed the unopened envelope between them. "I'm here now." Ben folded his hands. "The operating loan is seriously delinquent. We've already extended the payment schedule twice. Harvest hasn't cleared yet, I know. Once grain moves, I can make a substantial payment." Ben turned his monitor slightly and showed her the figures. Martha hated how clean numbers looked when they were describing disaster. "A substantial payment won't cure the delinquency," he said. "Not at the current projected revenue. Prices could improve." "They could. We can't base the deadline on that," he explained the next steps without drama. 30 days to bring the secured operating loan current. If she could not, the bank would proceed with foreclosure. Martha looked at the balance, then at the value of expected grain sales, mentally subtracting fuel, drying, storage, repairs, taxes. She did the calculation twice. The result did not change. "There has to be another extension." Ben shook his head. "I've used the flexibility I have. Caleb and I never walked away from an obligation." "I'm not saying you did." "Then don't talk to me like I'm done." Ben's expression tightened with sympathy, which irritated her more than anger would have. "I'm telling you because I don't want you surprised later." Martha stood. "I won't be." She drove home without turning on the radio. The cornfields along the county road looked golden in the afternoon light, prosperous from a distance. At home, she carried the certified notice into Caleb's small office off the kitchen. His old desk still held sharpened pencils, seed catalogs, and a coffee stain she had never scrubbed away. Martha opened the bottom drawer and slid the foreclosure notice beneath a stack of tax folders. Emily called that evening from Des Moines. Martha let it ring twice before answering. Her daughter talked about work, traffic, and coming up soon. Martha said nothing about the bank. After dark, she stepped onto the porch. Beyond the yard, 164 acres disappeared into the black. She and Caleb had spent 34 years building a life there. She could almost hear him asking what the numbers said. Martha gripped the porch rail and looked toward the fields. "The bank is not taking this farm," she said aloud. The promise sounded strong in the dark. She had 30 days and no realistic way to keep it. The next morning, Martha covered the kitchen table with bills, loan statements, machinery lists, and 3 sharpened pencils. She began with the assumption that every problem had a number attached to it. If the bank wanted money, she would find money. She listed equipment she could sell without stopping harvest entirely. An older tractor attachment, a grain wagon Caleb had bought used, several implements they rarely needed anymore. She postponed a fertilizer order and called 2 suppliers to ask whether outstanding balances could be stretched another month. One agreed. The other reminded her politely that her account was already overdue. By noon, Martha had reduced expenses on paper until there was almost nothing left to cut. The gap remained. She drove across the county to Luke Brennan's farm with her equipment list. Luke had farmed the neighboring acreage for decades and had been Caleb's closest friend. At 62, he had the irritating habit of studying a problem silently before saying exactly what Martha did not want to hear. He examined her list beside his machine shed. "You could sell the wagon." "How much?" He named a figure. Martha frowned. Caleb paid almost twice that. Caleb bought it 9 years ago. She pointed to the tractor attachment. Luke lowered her estimate again. "At auction." Maybe less if buyers know you need it gone quickly. Martha folded the paper. Everybody thinks farmers are sitting on a fortune in equipment until you actually have to sell it. Luke watched her. How much are you trying to raise? Enough. That's not a number. It's the number I've got. He did not press her, but his silence followed her home. Martha was photographing equipment for listings when Emily's car turned into the driveway shortly after 3. Martha straightened slowly. Her daughter had said she might visit soon. She had not said today. Emily stepped out wearing work clothes beneath a light jacket, her dark hair pulled back. Why are you selling the grain wagon? No greeting, Martha lowered her phone. Hello to you too. I saw the listing. Then you already know. Emily looked toward the machine shed. Mom, what's going on? I'm getting rid of equipment I don't need. You and Dad use that wagon every harvest. Your father isn't here. Emily, I don't need everything we owned when there were 2 of us. The words landed harder than Martha intended. Emily's expression softened, but only briefly. Is the farm in trouble? Farming is always trouble. That's not an answer. Martha walked toward the house. Emily followed. At the kitchen table, the papers Martha had forgotten to put away answered more than she wanted. Emily picked up a loan statement. How far behind are you? Martha took it from her. I'm handling it. Is that why you're selling equipment? Partly. Is the farm in danger? Martha hesitated. Emily saw it. Mom, the bank gave me time. How much time? 30 days. Emily sat down. For several seconds, she said nothing. 30 days until what? Until they move forward. With foreclosure, Martha began stacking papers. Harvest income will reduce what I owe. Will it stop it? Martha did not answer. Emily pushed her chair back. Then sell before they take the choice away from you. Martha stared at her. Sell the farm voluntarily, while you still have equity. Before legal costs and a forced sale eat through everything. This farm was your father's life. It was his work. It was your work too. 34 years. Emily, I know. No, you live in Des Moines. You visit. That's different. Hurt crossed Emily's face. And what exactly do you think Dad would want you? For you to sell everything except the land and sit here with no money because leaving feels disloyal? Martha stood. We're done talking about this. Emily stood too. Dad is gone. Mom, losing yourself won't bring him back. Martha's hand tightened around the loan statement. Emily immediately looked as though she wished she could take the sentence back. But Martha opened the door. Drive safely. After Emily left, silence settled over the farmhouse. Martha remained at the table until sunset. Then she went into Caleb's office. Angry enough to search for proof that everyone else was wrong, Caleb had kept old farm ledgers for years, recording crop yields, repair costs, loans, land rent, and small transactions in cramped handwriting. Martha pulled one from the shelf and began turning pages. Most entries were ordinary: seed, diesel, parts, grain sales. Then a line near the bottom of an older page caught her attention. Briggs, $4,800. The amount had been crossed through once in Caleb's pen. Beside it were 2 words: paid enough. Martha read the entry again. She remembered the Briggs family. She remembered money changing hands years ago. What she did not remember was the Briggses ever repaying $4,800. With their own farm, never wealthy and now 30 days from foreclosure, Martha could not understand why Caleb had erased a debt they could have used. Martha carried Caleb's ledger in her truck the next morning. Though she told herself she was only going into Bell Creek because the combine needed attention, the whining bearing had grown louder, and delaying the repair any longer risked turning an expensive problem into a catastrophic one. Noah Briggs ran a small agricultural repair shop near the edge of town. At 27, he was young enough that Martha still remembered him as a skinny boy trailing his father through farm auctions. He wiped his hands on a rag when she pulled in. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." "Martha, I've told you that." "You have. What's wrong?" She described the combine noise. Noah asked several questions, then promised to come out that afternoon. Martha should have left. Instead, she took the ledger from the truck. "Do you recognize this?" Noah looked at the open page. His expression changed when he saw his surname. "Where do you find that?" "Caleb's records." She tapped the crossed-out amount. "I remember your family borrowing money. I don't remember this being repaid." Noah leaned against the workbench. "It wasn't. Not all of it." "Then why did Caleb write, 'paid enough'?" Noah was quiet. "Dad got hurt that year. You remember Martha did, vaguely. A machinery accident, months without steady work. I was supposed to start vocational training that fall." Noah continued. "My parents were going to tell me I couldn't go. Your husband found out." Martha frowned. "Caleb loaned your father money for bills, some, but part of that money paid for my training." Martha looked down at the figure. $4,800. That was what remained later. Dad paid what he could when I started earning. I tried taking over the rest, and Caleb refused, Noah nodded. He said I'd already spent enough weekends fixing equipment for people who couldn't afford shop rates. Said if I wanted to repay him, I should keep doing that when I could. Martha remembered signing a check years ago at Caleb's request, but she had been dealing with planting invoices and insurance paperwork that week. She had forgotten where the money went. Noah had not. "We couldn't afford to forgive $4,800, she said. Noah's face tightened. "I know. That wasn't aimed at you. I know that too." He looked at the ledger. "Your husband never acted like we owed him afterward. Neither did you." Martha closed the book. "Apparently I forgot the whole thing. We didn't." That afternoon, Noah came to Hale Farm and listened to the combine. After removing a panel and inspecting the bearing assembly, he gave Martha an estimate substantially lower than she expected. She studied the paper. "What did you leave out?" "Nothing important. Labor. I discounted it." "Why?" Noah gave her a look that made the question unnecessary. "No, Martha. I came here for a repair, not repayment from 20 years ago. I'm not giving you free work." "Then charge your normal rate. Parts at cost, labor discounted. That's the invoice." She almost argued again, but the bank deadline flashed through her mind. Every dollar mattered. Accepting a reduced labor charge felt dangerously close to admitting she needed help. "Fine," she said. "Discounted, not free." Noah smiled slightly. "Understood." While he worked, Martha called the grain buyer. She asked whether moving part of the harvest earlier might improve cash flow and whether different delivery timing could change the price. They worked through several possibilities. One option would get money into her account sooner, but storage and drying costs reduced the benefit. Another might produce a slightly better price if the market moved in her favor, but she could not gamble a foreclosure deadline on that. She wrote the revised projection on the back of an envelope. Even after equipment sales, grain income, and every expense she could postpone, the gap remained painfully large. Her phone rang before supper. "Ben Carter, I wanted to make sure you understood that the 30-day timeline hasn't changed," he said. "I understand dates, Ben. Have you identified a source for the delinquent amount?" "I'm working on it. If you want to discuss voluntary sale options or restructuring possibilities before we get further along, not today." Ben paused. "All right, but waiting reduces your options after the call." Martha stood beside the combine while Noah tested the repaired assembly. The machine ran smoothly. For a moment, one problem in her life had an identifiable cause, a replacement part, and a solution. She paid Noah exactly what the invoice required, That night, she reopened Caleb's ledger. She wanted to understand the Briggs entry, nothing more. Instead, several pages later, she noticed another amount crossed out beside a Bell Creek surname she recognized. Then another. One mentioned rent. Another had a notation about feed. Farther back, Caleb had drawn a single line through a larger figure and written nothing beside it at all. Martha pulled a second ledger from the shelf. Within minutes, she found 2 more crossed-out entries. Different families, different years. She sat in Caleb's chair and spread the books across his desk. Briggs had not been an exception. Again and again, during years when Hale Farm had carried loans of its own. Caleb had recorded money people owed them and later erased it. Martha touched one familiar surname, trying to remember what had happened. Whatever Caleb had been doing, he had quietly forgiven far more than $4,800. By the following afternoon, Martha had made a list of 6 crossed-out entries from Caleb's ledgers. She began with the ones she remembered. One family had received several loads of corn and feed during a winter when their income collapsed. Martha remembered Caleb loading the truck after dark. She had complained about the fuel, then packed sandwiches for the drive. Another entry belonged to a tenant farmer who had rented a small piece of Hale acreage years earlier. His wife became seriously ill, and rent stopped arriving for months. Caleb had written the unpaid amount into the ledger, then eventually drawn a line through it. Martha remembered that too. They had told the man to catch up when he could. Apparently, they had never asked again. A third surname brought back a harvest nearly 15 years earlier. A neighboring farmer had been hospitalized just as his corn was ready. Caleb moved their own schedule around, and Martha spent 2 long days driving grain carts while Caleb and several neighbors harvested the man's acreage. The ledger showed fuel and labor costs. Both were crossed out. Martha stared at the page. None of it had seemed remarkable at the time. Farms helped farms because weather did not wait for illness. But now every forgiven dollar looked different when measured against a foreclosure notice. She drove into Bell Creek for coffee and found June Wallace behind the counter at the diner, at 67. June had known the Hales long enough to remember arguments Martha had forgotten having. She poured coffee without asking. Martha placed a folded sheet of surnames beside the cup. "Do these mean anything to you?" June adjusted her glasses. "Most of them." Caleb had money recorded beside their names. Then he crossed it out. June looked at Martha over the paper. "And I'm trying to understand why you were there for half of these." Apparently, I wasn't paying attention. 2 pointed to one name. "That family nearly lost everything when their youngest was sick. You brought feed twice that winter." "I remember bringing it. I don't remember deciding it was free." "Maybe you never formally decided," June pointed to another. "Caleb let him delay rent for almost a year. His wife was going through treatment." Martha rubbed her forehead. "We had bills too." "Of course you did." "Then why were we doing this?" June's expression softened. "Because you two were terrible at keeping score when somebody was hurting." Martha disliked the warmth in June's voice. It made ordinary choices sound noble. And Martha did not want nobility attached to bad bookkeeping. "None of this matters now. You came in asking about it because I found the records. Why were you looking through old records?" Martha lifted her coffee. "Farm business." June waited, but Martha offered nothing else. "Past favors don't pay current bills," Martha said. "No," June agreed. "Usually they don't." The answer was practical enough that Martha felt relieved. She left after finishing her coffee and spent the next morning working on the harvest projections. The crop buyer called shortly before noon with updated quality results on part of her corn. Moisture was not the only problem. Test weight and quality on several loads meant the price would be lower than Martha had projected. She asked him to repeat the adjustment. Then she recalculated. The first number was bad. The second, after drying and transportation costs, was worse. Martha called Luke and asked what he thought several remaining pieces of equipment might bring if sold quickly. He named realistic figures. "You're running out of things you can sell without making the farm harder to operate," he said. "I know what I own." "Then you know selling productive equipment to cover operating debt can turn into a circle." "I need cash now." Luke went quiet. "Is this about the bank?" Martha looked through the kitchen window toward the machine shed. "It's about getting through the season." "Martha, I asked for equipment values." "Luke, and I gave them to you." She thanked him and ended the call before he could ask anything else. For the rest of the afternoon, Martha listed assets and crossed them off one by one. Grain wagon, attachment, older implements, a small trailer. Even at optimistic prices, the total did not close the gap. At realistic distressed sale prices, it came nowhere near it. She opened the bank notice and counted the remaining days. The paper had stopped frightening her because fear required uncertainty. The numbers were becoming brutally clear. That evening she returned to Caleb's ledgers, but the crossed-out debts no longer felt like clues to money she might collect. Martha would never knock on someone's door demanding payment for feed delivered 15 years earlier or labor Caleb had deliberately forgiven. Whatever those old amounts once meant, they were gone. She closed the books and opened her current spreadsheet again. The revised grain price had widened the shortfall. If she sold nearly every movable piece of equipment that was not essential to bringing in the crop, she would still be short. For the first time since leaving Ben Carter's office, Martha could not find even an unrealistic version of the numbers in which she reached the deadline. Martha sold the tractor attachment first. A man from 2 counties over arrived with a flatbed trailer, walked around it twice, pointed out worn paint and a hairline crack Martha had already accounted for, then offered less than Luke had predicted. She wanted to refuse. Instead, she looked at the bank deadline written on the calendar beside the refrigerator and accepted. 2 smaller implements sold 3 days later. The money went directly into the farm account, and for several hours Martha let herself feel the satisfaction of movement. Then she updated the numbers. The gap was still too large. Luke arrived that afternoon while she was photographing another piece of equipment. He parked near the machine shed and watched her take pictures. "What are you selling now, cultivator?" "You use that." "Not every season." "That isn't what I asked." Martha lowered the phone. "I know what I can spare." Luke stepped closer. "How bad is it?" "I'm handling it." "You've sold equipment, delayed bills, and started pricing things Caleb swore he'd never get rid of." "That doesn't look handled." Martha turned away. "I don't need an inspection." "No. You need money." She looked back sharply. Luke did not soften. "How much?" "Enough that I'm not borrowing from friends." "I didn't say borrowing." "You were about to." "I can cover part of the shortfall." "No." "You don't even know what I was going to offer." "It doesn't matter." "It matters if the bank takes the farm." Martha's face tightened. "I will not turn 30 years of friendship into another debt." Luke folded his arms. "You think I'd hold it over you?" "I think debt changes things. Sometimes it doesn't." I said no. He stared at her for a long moment. "You call it independence because pride sounds uglier." Martha's anger came fast. "And you call it help because that sounds better than pity." Luke flinched, but only slightly. "Caleb would have taken help if it kept you from losing the place. You don't know that. I knew him almost as long as you did. Then you should know he paid what he owed." Luke's jaw tightened. "That isn't the same thing as refusing every hand somebody offers." Martha picked up her phone. "We're done." Luke nodded once. "Fine. But the bank won't care what word you use for pride." He left without another argument. Martha stood alone beside the cultivator until the screen on her phone went dark. Emily arrived the next morning. This time she did not begin with questions. She walked into the kitchen, placed her purse on a chair, and looked directly at the foreclosure notice Martha had finally left on the table. "You said the bank gave you time." Martha stopped in the doorway. "They did. You didn't say there was an actual foreclosure deadline. I said 30 days. You made it sound negotiable. Everything is negotiable until it isn't." Emily picked up the notice. "How much are you short?" Martha gave her the current figure. Emily stared at her. "Even after selling equipment?" "Yes, Mom. This is worse than you told me." "I didn't ask you to solve it. That's exactly the problem." Martha's exhaustion turned defensive. "You want me to sell? I already know your solution. I want you to have somewhere secure to live. I have somewhere, for now." Martha's expression hardened. "This farm was your father's life and yours, but that doesn't mean it has to become your grave." "Enough." "No. You keep saying Dad built this place like that means losing it would erase him. You never understood what it took." Emily's face changed. "I grew up here. And then you left because you and Dad told me to build my own life." "Exactly. Then why are you punishing me for having one?" Martha had no answer ready, so she reached for anger instead. "You come up from Des Moines and tell me to sell because the land means less to you." Emily stood very still. "That's not true. It's easier for you. Of course it's easier for me than for you. That doesn't make me wrong." Her voice shook now. "Keeping this farm cannot matter more than you having money, housing, health, and a life after Dad." Martha turned toward the sink. "I'm not discussing this again." Emily picked up her purse. "You don't have to. You've decided not listening is the same thing as deciding." The front door closed hard enough to rattle the glass. Martha remained in the kitchen, staring at the empty chair. By evening, the anger had drained away and left something worse. She went into Caleb's office because she could not bear the silence anywhere else. She pulled down the ledgers again, then began checking the lower shelf where Caleb had kept tractor manuals and old parts catalogs. A small black pocket notebook slipped from behind them and fell to the floor. Martha recognized it immediately. Caleb carried notebooks during planting and harvest, filling them with reminders nobody else could decipher. She sat in his chair and opened it. The first pages held ordinary notes bearings: fuel, fence repair, dates, names. Then the pattern changed. Bell Creek's surnames appeared one after another, some familiar from the ledgers, others not. There were almost no dollar amounts. Beside one name, Caleb had written, "Used tractor 3 days." Beside another, "Corn delivered, no invoice." Another read, "Work until he gets steady again." Martha turned the page. More names, more small records of help she had forgotten. Near the bottom of one page, Caleb had written a sentence and underlined it once. "Helped when we could." Martha read it twice, then looked toward the dark window. The notebook was not a record of money people owed them. Caleb had been keeping track of something else entirely. Martha spent the next morning matching Caleb's pocket notebook to old ledgers, calendars, and receipts. The entries were brief enough to look meaningless unless she already knew part of the story. Work until steady again belonged to a man Caleb had hired during a winter when his construction job disappeared. Martha remembered adding his name to payroll even though there had barely been enough work for him. Corn delivered. No invoice matched a family whose father had been recovering from surgery. Another name carried the note house until April. Martha remembered the unused farmhouse they had allowed a young couple to stay in temporarily when rent in town became impossible for them. None of the entries described heroism. They described ordinary needs answered with whatever Hale Farm happened to have work. Machinery, corn, space, time. One notation read, planter 5 days. Another, harvested south 80 while hospitalized. Martha remembered that harvest. Caleb had come home after midnight 3 nights in a row, exhausted and covered in dust. Because weather was closing in and their neighbor could not leave the hospital, Martha had driven grain carts and brought food. Nobody sent an invoice afterward. She closed the notebook. She had participated in more of these decisions than she wanted to admit. Yet Caleb had remembered them when she had not. Not as accounts receivable, just names. That afternoon, Luke came by to return a socket set Caleb had lent him years earlier, and Luke had apparently forgotten in his shop. Martha suspected the timing was an excuse, but she let him inside anyway. They stood in the kitchen with coffee between them and the black notebook on the table. "Your name is in here," Martha said. Luke looked at the notebook, but did not reach for it. "Probably more than once," one entry says. "Luke planting, first year." What does that mean? Luke's expression shifted. "You really don't remember? I remember your first farm." "I don't remember why Caleb wrote it down." Luke leaned back. "My father died that spring, right before planting." Martha remembered the funeral, the wet roads. Luke at 20-something trying not to cry beside his mother. "You had ground rented," she said. 80 acres, and no idea how I was going to get it planted while settling everything Dad left behind. Caleb had his own corn to put in. Weather window was getting tight. Luke looked toward the fields outside. "He delayed part of yours and brought his planter over to mine." A memory returned in pieces, Caleb leaving before daylight. Martha carrying covered dishes into Luke's kitchen. 2 exhausted men eating at a table without speaking much because there was still work waiting. "I brought meals," she said, "every day for nearly a week." Luke replied, "You also ran parts into town twice." "That wasn't anything." Luke gave her a tired smile. "It was as if you were the one who needed it." Martha looked down at Caleb's handwriting. "Is that why you offered me money?" "Partly." "Luke, that was decades ago. Time doesn't cancel gratitude. Caleb didn't help you because he expected repayment. Neither am I." She shook her head. "I still can't take your money." Luke's disappointment showed. But he did not argue this time. "Then don't call it a loan. Don't call it anything. Just remember that needing somebody once didn't make me less of a farmer." Martha met his eyes. "I said I can't." "I heard you." After he left, she remained at the table with the notebook open. Her refusal no longer felt as clean as it had before. She had spent weeks insisting debt changed relationships. Yet Caleb's records showed relationships that had survived precisely because he had refused to treat every kindness as a transaction. Still, understanding that did not make accepting thousands of dollars easier. 2 days later, a sedan from Hawthorne Community Bank turned into the driveway. Martha saw Ben Carter step out carrying a document envelope. She knew before he reached the porch. "You could have mailed it," she said. "I wanted to explain where things stand." She led him into the kitchen but did not offer coffee. Ben placed the papers on the table. "This is the formal foreclosure notice. The prior cure period has run down. From this point, the amount and date are fixed." Martha read the figure. Harvest proceeds and equipment sales had reduced the delinquency, but not enough. 7 days. To cure the remaining amount before the bank moves forward. And if I bring in part of it, it has to be the cure amount. Martha. "No extension. Not one I can authorize." Ben's voice remained measured. "If you want to discuss alternatives before then, call me immediately." Martha signed acknowledgement of receipt where he indicated. Ben gathered his copy, hesitated, then left without offering false reassurance. His car disappeared down the county road. Martha stood on the porch holding the notice while wind moved through the corn. 7 days was not enough time to sell land properly. It was barely enough time to move grain, collect equipment sale money, and make one final attempt at the numbers. She returned to the kitchen and set the foreclosure notice beside Caleb's notebook. On one side lay the exact amount the bank required. On the other were decades of names with no amounts attached at all. For the first time, Martha was not certain which record frightened her more. 7 days remained. Martha spent the first of the 7 remaining days making calls she had avoided for weeks. She asked another lender about refinancing the operating debt. The answer came back before lunch. Hale Farm's projected income was too weak, the existing secured debt too high, and the timeline too short. She called a land broker about selling a small section of acreage. He explained that even an aggressive sale would require surveys, title work, negotiations, and closing time she no longer had. Could it be done in 7 days? Martha asked. The man was quiet for a moment. Not responsibly. She thanked him and hung up. The next 2 days were consumed by harvest. Noah's repair held, and the combine ran without trouble. Luke helped coordinate grain movement despite their unresolved argument. Saying little beyond what the work required, Martha sold what corn she could move immediately. The payment reduced the delinquency enough to make the number look less impossible, but not enough to make it payable. Each night she returned to the kitchen table, entered new figures, and watched the remaining shortfall refuse to disappear. On the 4th evening, Emily came through the back door carrying a laptop and a paper bag of food. Martha looked up from the bank statements. "You didn't call. You wouldn't have answered honestly anyway." There was no anger in Emily's voice this time, only exhaustion. She set the food down and pulled out a chair. "Tell me the exact amount." Martha hesitated. Then she turned the foreclosure notice around. Emily read it twice. "That's what's left after the grain sales, yes, and the equipment included? Any chance of refinancing? No. Land sale? Not before the deadline." Emily closed her eyes briefly. Okay. Martha expected another argument about selling everything. Instead, Emily opened her laptop. "Show me the books." For 3 hours they worked through expenses, debt, projected harvest income, insurance, taxes, supplier balances, and equipment costs. Emily asked questions without accusing. Martha answered without hiding. They found small savings, but nothing close to the cure amount. Near midnight, Emily leaned back. "You really have tried everything." Martha looked at the spreadsheet. "Everything I can think of. I thought you were just refusing to see reality because of Dad." Martha's hand rested on the edge of Caleb's old ledger. "Maybe some of that is true." Emily waited. Martha found the words harder than numbers. "I kept telling myself that if I could keep the farm exactly as it was, then I was keeping our life intact. Your father dies, but the acres stay, the equipment stays, the routines stay. Mom, I know that sounds foolish. It sounds like grief." Martha looked toward the dark kitchen window. "You were right about one thing. I've been acting like changing the farm means admitting I can't live the way I did when Caleb was here." Emily reached across the table and touched her hand. "And I was wrong to make it sound like the farm means nothing except grief. You built a life here too." Martha's eyes burned unexpectedly. "I shouldn't have said you didn't understand because you left. I know why you said it. That doesn't make it fair." They sat quietly for a moment before returning to the numbers. The next afternoon, Martha stopped at Bell Creek Diner after delivering paperwork to the bank. June poured coffee and immediately noticed the strain in her face. How bad Martha almost gave her usual answer. Instead, she said, "The foreclosure deadline is 3 days away." June stopped wiping the counter. 3 days? Martha nodded. I'm still short. June's expression tightened. How short? Enough, Martha. She gave June the figure in a low voice. June stared at her. Does Luke know? He knows. It's serious, Emily. She knows everything. Who else? Nobody needs to. June folded the dish towel in half. People are going to notice if the bank takes Hale Farm. They can notice afterward. You don't mean that. I mean, I don't want my finances turned into town entertainment. June's face hardened slightly. Nobody said entertainment. Then promise me you won't spread it. June held her gaze. I won't publicize your private numbers. Or the deadline. After a pause. June nodded. I won't announce it. Martha accepted that as enough. What she did not know was that Emily, working from Caleb's pocket notebook that evening, had begun making calls of her own. She was not asking anyone for money. She contacted people whose names appeared beside old notes and asked practical questions. Did they know anyone who might buy equipment quickly? Did they know of a farmer willing to lease acreage? Had anyone dealt with emergency refinancing? The first call led to another. Someone recognized a name. Someone asked why Emily was trying to raise cash so quickly. Someone else already knew Martha had been selling equipment. Bell Creek was small enough that concern traveled faster than explanation. By the following morning, Noah Briggs had heard that Hale Farm might be in trouble. By noon, 2 former neighbors had called Luke. At the diner, June heard 3 different versions of the same rumor and refused to confirm any of them. Then someone mentioned the word foreclosure. By evening, the question was no longer whether Martha was struggling. People were asking how much time she had left. 3 days remained when Bell Creek began to understand that Hale Farm was not merely having a bad year. It was 7 days from foreclosure when the formal notice arrived, and now nearly all of those days were gone. The town finally knew the farm could actually disappear. The first person arrived at Hale Farm shortly after 7 the next morning. Martha was checking a grain bin when Noah Briggs pulled into the yard with his service truck. She assumed something had gone wrong with the combine. Instead, Noah handed her an invoice. The labor line showed 0. Martha looked at him. We already discussed this. We did? Then put the labor back on. No, Noah. The repair is finished. Parts are paid. Labor is mine to decide. Martha felt heat rise into her face. I am not taking free work because people in town have started gossiping. This isn't gossip. Then what is it? Noah met her eyes. Something I should have done a long time ago. Before she could argue further, another pickup turned into the driveway. A neighboring farmer stepped out, pointed toward a fuel tank, and said a delivery was coming later that morning. Already paid for, he added. Martha stared at him. By who? Does it matter? Yes. A few of us cancel it. Too late, by noon. The fuel had arrived. Someone left 2 grocery bags on the back porch. A local feed supplier called to say an outstanding service charge had been covered anonymously. Martha's embarrassment hardened into anger. She called Emily. What did you do? Emily answered from Des Moines. What do you mean? People are showing up here with paid fuel and free repairs? Silence. I didn't organize that. You called people? I asked about equipment buyers and refinancing and told them everything. I told them enough to understand why I was asking. That was not yours to tell. I know. Emily's voice softened. But I did not ask anyone to bring you money. Martha looked through the window at the groceries on the porch. Then who did? Maybe nobody asked them. Martha ended the call before she said something she would regret. She drove into Bell Creek and went directly to the diner. June saw her expression and set down the coffee pot. You knew? I knew people were worried. You promised me. I promised not to publicize your private numbers. Everyone knows They know the farm may be foreclosed. They do not know your bank balance from me. Martha leaned both hands on the counter. Tell them to stop. June's expression changed. I can't. You know half this town. Exactly. Which is why I know they're not doing this because they think you're helpless. It feels exactly like that. June shook her head. Then you're looking at the wrong part. She pointed toward a booth near the window. An older man Martha recognized stood and approached slowly. Years earlier, Caleb had helped harvest his acreage while he was hospitalized. I heard about the farm, he said. Martha immediately raised a hand. Please don't. I'm not offering money. He took a folded photograph from his jacket. It showed two combines working side by side beneath a gray sky. One had belonged to Caleb. My wife took this the week you and Caleb saved my crop. I was in the hospital thinking I'd lose everything. Martha looked at the photograph. A lot of people helped. You were one of them, later. A woman Martha remembered as a young mother stopped her outside the diner. She recalled the winter when the Hales delivered corn and feed without charging. Another man mentioned temporary work Caleb had given him between jobs. None spoke as though they were settling accounts. They simply remembered. Martha returned home unsettled rather than comforted. Luke was waiting near the machine shed. You heard, she said. Hard not to. I want it stopped. Why? Because I don't want Bell Creek turning me into a charity case. Luke leaned against his truck. Nobody here thinks you owe us pride. Martha looked away. That's easy to say when you're not the one everyone is trying to rescue. You and Caleb spent decades helping people through bad seasons. Did you think less of them afterward? No. Then why are you assuming they think less of you? She had no answer she liked. That evening, June came to the farmhouse carrying a handwritten flyer. Martha read the top line and immediately pushed it back across the table. Benefit auction for Hale Farm Bell Creek Grain Cooperative. No, it's already being organized. Cancel it. I'm not going to. June, this is my farm. Yes. My debt. Yes. Then I decide how it gets handled. June folded the flyer once. You decide what help you accept. You do not get to decide whether other people are allowed to offer it. Martha stood. I won't go. That's your choice. And if nobody comes, June almost smiled. That part isn't yours either. After she left, Martha remained in the kitchen with Caleb's pocket notebook open beside the flyer. Names filled the pages in his handwriting. For weeks, Martha had treated those names as evidence of money the Hales had once given away. Now the names were beginning to answer back. The benefit auction was already moving forward, and for the first time since the bank's notice arrived, Martha faced a problem she could not solve by cutting expenses, selling equipment, or refusing help. She could not control what the people of Bell Creek chose to remember. The benefit auction began the next afternoon at the Bell Creek Grain Cooperative, with folding tables, mismatched chairs, and more donated items than Martha expected anyone to want. She had intended to stay home. Emily arrived from Des Moines an hour before it started and stood in the kitchen until Martha finally put on her coat. I'm not making a speech, Martha said. Nobody asked you to, and I'm not pretending I'm comfortable with this. You don't have to. The cooperative lot was already crowded when they arrived. June had organized baked goods along one wall. Farmers had donated tools, seed, spare parts, and services. Noah offered repair labor. Someone auctioned snow removal for an entire winter. Martha sat near the back beside Emily, wishing every familiar face would stop turning toward her. The first items brought ordinary prices. Then a used toolbox worth perhaps $60 sold for $300. A pie went for $250. Martha leaned toward Emily. This is ridiculous. Emily watched another bidder raise his hand. I don't think they're buying the pie. Larger contributions followed. A former tenant family who had moved out of Iowa sent a check after hearing about the foreclosure. A farmer pledged proceeds from part of a grain sale. Bell Creek businesses contributed cash and gift certificates that were immediately auctioned. Two men who had once worked temporary jobs at Hale Farm returned and stood awkwardly beside Martha, while explaining that Caleb had hired them during years when neither had steady work. "He knew there wasn't enough work for both of us," one admitted. "Kept us on anyway." Martha remembered the payroll entries. She had complained to Caleb that winter about labor costs. She also remembered quietly adding extra hours when one of the men had a new baby as the auction continued. Caleb's notebook seemed to come alive around her. Names she had read at the kitchen table now had faces. Grown children, gray hair, families of their own. Nobody mentioned repayment terms. Nobody calculated interest. They remembered a machine borrowed, a field harvested, a month of rent delayed, corn delivered when money was short. Near evening, June handed Emily the running total. Emily studied it, then passed it to Martha. Her heart lifted before she could stop it. Then she compared the amount with the cure figure Ben Carter had given her. They were still short. Not by as much as before, but enough. "That's everything Martha asked, from today." "Yes," Emily said quietly. The bank deadline was the following morning. There was no crop payment left to accelerate, no equipment sale that could close overnight, no refinancing waiting for approval. Martha looked around the cooperative. People were still stacking chairs and carrying empty trays outside. They had done more than she had believed possible, and it still was not enough. Strangely, the realization did not crush her the way she expected. She had spent weeks believing that if the farm was lost, it would prove she had failed Caleb. Now she looked at people whose lives had crossed Hale Farm for decades and understood the farm had already meant more than the acreage she might lose. June asked if Martha wanted to say anything before people left. Martha almost refused. Then she stood. Conversations faded. "I don't know how to be comfortable with this," she began. A few people smiled. "Most of you probably know that already." Emily lowered her eyes, smiling too. Martha held Caleb's pocket notebook against her side. "I found records Caleb kept. Names of people we helped over the years. I didn't remember half of it. I thought that meant those things weren't important." She looked around the room. "Apparently I was wrong." Her voice tightened. "You gave more today than I had any right to expect. The truth is, we're still short. And tomorrow, the bank deadline arrives. I don't know what happens after that." Nobody moved. "But whatever happens, what you did today was enough. I need you to know that. Thank you." She sat before emotion could take the rest of her words. "Outside." Luke caught her near the truck. "You meant that, every word, even the part about it being enough, especially that." Luke glanced toward the cooperative doors. "People aren't finished." Martha frowned. "The auction is over. I didn't say the auction, Luke." "No more." He opened her truck door. "Go home." Martha, she was too tired to argue. Emily stayed the night. Neither woman slept much. Before dawn, Martha woke to a low engine sound outside. Then another. She pulled on jeans and a sweater and walked through the dark kitchen. Emily appeared in the hallway behind her. "What is that?" Martha opened the front door. Headlights moved along the county road. A pickup turned into the driveway, followed by another. Behind them came cars, farm trucks, and work vans, their lights stretching farther down the road than Martha could see. Vehicles began filling the yard and roadside while figures stepped out into the cold morning. Martha stood barefoot inside her boots, one hand gripping the porch rail. The bank deadline was only hours away. Somehow, before foreclosure could begin, The whole town was arriving at Hale Farm. Martha stepped off the porch as the first pickup doors opened. Luke came toward her carrying a large envelope. Behind him, June climbed from a car with a metal cash box, and Noah stood beside his service truck holding a stack of smaller envelopes bound with a rubber band. More vehicles kept arriving. "What did you do?" Martha asked. Luke handed her the envelope. "Not me. Everybody." June opened the cash box on the hood of a truck. The auction got people talking. Last night they kept calling. Some contributions were $20, others were $50 or $100. A retired couple brought $500 they said they could spare. One Bell Creek business had matched its employees' contributions. A farmer handed over a check representing part of his grain proceeds. Former residents who had heard about Hale Farm sent money electronically overnight. Noah's stack included contributions collected through his repair shop. Emily came down the porch steps, staring at the growing line of people. "There's more," June told her. "A school class did a little collection. It isn't much." Martha looked at the envelope a teacher held out. "It's too much." The teacher shook her head. They wanted to help. At the kitchen table, Emily, June, and Luke counted while Martha stood beside Caleb's old desk calculator. Every total was checked twice. Nobody celebrated when they reached the amount from the auction because the bank's cure figure was still higher. Then June added the final morning contributions. Emily stopped typing. "Do it again." Luke did. Martha watched the calculator display change. The number exceeded the amount needed to cure the delinquency by a small margin. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Martha sat down. She had imagined saving the farm would feel like winning. Instead, she covered her face and cried. Emily knelt beside her and put an arm around her shoulders. "Mom, I can't take all this." Luke pulled out the chair opposite her. "You can take enough to stop the foreclosure. People need their own money. They decided what they could give." Martha lowered her hands. "Caleb never expected any of this back." Noah, standing in the doorway, answered quietly, "That's probably why people remembered." There was no time for ceremony. The bank deadline remained. Emily organized the funds while June documented the contributions, and Luke drove Martha into Bell Creek. By the time they entered Hawthorne Community Bank, Ben Carter was already expecting them. He took the documentation, verified transfers, counted certified funds, and disappeared twice to confirm figures. Martha sat rigidly between Emily and Luke. Finally, Ben returned with a printed statement. "The cure amount has been satisfied." Martha stared at him, meaning foreclosure does not proceed. Emily exhaled sharply. Luke leaned back. Martha remained still. "The farm is safe." Ben chose his words carefully. "The immediate foreclosure is stopped. You still have the remaining legitimate debt." Martha: "Bringing the delinquency current doesn't erase that. I know." For once, hearing about debt did not feel like a threat. It felt like a problem that could be worked. Ben opened another folder. They discussed restructuring the remaining balance around lower annual operating exposure. Martha could not continue farming all 164 acres exactly as before and expect different results. This time, she did not argue with arithmetic. In the following weeks, she negotiated a fair lease with Luke for part of the acreage. The lease provided dependable income while reducing Martha's seed, fuel, fertilizer, and machinery costs. She kept the farmhouse and enough ground to continue growing corn herself on a smaller scale. Emily helped her establish limits for operating expenses and emergency reserves. When Martha caught herself saying Caleb would never have reduced the farm, Emily asked, "Do you know that Martha looked across the kitchen at his empty chair?" "No," she admitted. "I suppose I don't." The hardest lesson was that saving Hale Farm did not require preserving every acre exactly as it had been on the last morning Caleb walked it. Bell Creek held a gathering after the restructuring was complete. Martha tried to thank everyone individually until Noah Briggs stopped her beside the cooperative doors. "You already did," he said. "I certainly did not." Noah smiled. "Most of us are just late paying you back." The words followed her home. That night, she opened Caleb's old ledger to the Briggs entry. Briggs. $4,800 paid enough. For weeks, Martha had thought the phrase meant Caleb had decided a debt no longer mattered. Now she understood it differently. He had never believed kindness created an account that needed exact repayment. There was no balance sheet connecting a bag of groceries to a harvested field, or $20 from a school child to vocational school money given decades earlier. The numbers did not match because they were never supposed to. What remained were relationships. By the next harvest, Hale Farm looked different. Luke worked the leased acreage while Martha operated the smaller portion she had kept. She still rose before sunrise. She still checked moisture, watched weather, worried over fuel, and paid bills at the kitchen table. But when a machine developed a bad vibration, she called Noah instead of trying to postpone the repair until something broke. When she needed an extra set of hands, she called Luke. Asking still felt uncomfortable. She did it anyway. Emily came from Des Moines one evening during harvest, years earlier. Martha would have eaten standing at the counter and hurried back outside. Instead, when Emily set dinner on the table, Martha looked through the window at unfinished work and sat down. "You're stopping?" Emily asked. "Corn will still be there in 40 minutes. Emily smiled. "Who are you?" Martha laughed, and the sound surprised them both. A few days later, weather reports warned of an approaching storm. Martha went outside before dawn, expecting a long day. In the opening gray light, pickups were already turning into the yard. Luke arrived first. Noah followed. 2 neighboring farmers came with equipment, and others joined them as the sky brightened. Nobody asked whether Martha deserved help. Nobody kept score. They simply went to work, bringing in corn before the weather changed. Martha stood at the edge of the field where, months earlier, she had promised herself she would save all 164 acres alone. She had been wrong about the acreage, and wrong about being alone. The farm belonged to her on paper, smaller now but sustainable. Yet as machines moved through the rows and neighbors worked beside her, Martha finally understood why the whole town had shown up before foreclosure. For decades, Hale Farm had quietly belonged to their stories too.